Blood dried black on his uniform. The desert stretched endless in every direction, and the woman standing over him, Apache, enemy, the reason good soldiers died, held the only water for 100 miles. Private Ethan Carter had 3 choices: trust the savage his commanders called subhuman, die of thirst under the merciless sun, or crawl back to a cavalry unit that had left him for dead. His hand moved toward his revolver. Her dark eyes tracked the movement without fear. In that moment, neither of them knew this decision would destroy everything he believed about civilization, honor, and which side of this war deserved to survive. If you want to see how a dying soldier and his sworn enemy forged the most dangerous alliance on the frontier, stay with me until the very end, and comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The ambush came at dawn when the light was still soft and deceptive. Ethan Carter had been riding rear guard, half asleep in his saddle, when the first arrow punched through Lieutenant Morrison's throat. The officer made a wet, choking sound and toppled sideways, boots still caught in the stirrups as his horse screamed and bolted. Then the world exploded into chaos, arrows hissing through sage smoke, rifles cracking from the rocks, men shouting orders that dissolved into screams. "Dismount! Defensive positions!" Sergeant Hayes was bellowing, but half the cavalry patrol was already down, thrashing in the dust or lying unnaturally still. Ethan hit the ground running, his Spencer rifle clutched against his chest. He was 19 years old, 3 months out of basic training at Fort Union, and he'd never fired a shot at another human being. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the rifle twice as he scrambled toward a cluster of boulders. An arrow missed his head by inches and shattered against stone. He threw himself behind the rocks, heart hammering so hard he could taste copper in his mouth. Return fire! Return fire, goddammit! Hayes again, his voice raw with fury and fear. Ethan tried to steady his rifle, tried to find a target in the smoke and chaos, but his vision kept blurring. Shapes moved in the rocks above. Quick, fluid, impossible to track. These weren't the clumsy savages the recruiting posters had promised. These were ghosts, smoke, death itself wearing human skin. A private named Coleman staggered past Ethan's position, both hands pressed against his stomach where his intestines were trying to push through his fingers. "Help me," Coleman whispered. "Oh Christ, help me! It hurts!" An arrow took him in the spine and he pitched forward into the dirt without another sound. Ethan vomited between his knees, rifle forgotten, tears streaming down his face. This wasn't glory. This wasn't the noble frontier war his recruiting officer had described over whiskey and patriotic speeches in a Philadelphia tavern. This was slaughter, and he was going to die here in this godforsaken desert, and his mother would never even know where they buried him, if they buried him at all. The firing intensified for another minute, a final, desperate surge from the surviving cavalrymen, and then began to fade. Silence crept back across the desert like a predator. Ethan pressed himself against the boulder, trying to make his body smaller, trying not to breathe. Footsteps crunched in the gravel, voices speaking a language he didn't understand. Apache, had to be Apache, moving among the bodies. A gunshot made him flinch. Then another. They were finishing the wounded. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut and prayed they wouldn't find him. Prayed harder than he'd ever prayed in his life, bargaining with a deity he'd mostly ignored since childhood. "Please, just let me live. I'll be better. I'll go to church. I'll write my mother every week. Just please, please let me live." The footsteps came closer. Stopped. Ethan could hear breathing on the other side of his boulder. Slow, controlled, patient. His hand crept toward his revolver, fingers wrapping around the grip with desperate slowness. The breathing moved away. The footsteps receded. Ethan remained frozen behind his rock for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Flies began to gather on the corpses. The smell of blood and opened bowels grew thick enough to choke on. Finally, when the silence had stretched so long it felt like the world had ended, Ethan risked looking around the edge of his boulder. The Apache were gone. The cavalry patrol was destroyed. 15 men reduced to scattered meat in the dirt. Flies crawled across Lieutenant Morrison's staring eyes. Sergeant Hayes lay on his back with his chest open to the sky, scalped so thoroughly that white bone gleamed through torn flesh. Ethan stumbled away from the massacre and vomited again, retching until nothing came up but bitter spit. His legs trembled so badly he had to sit down hard in the dust, rifle across his knees, fighting the urge to simply lie down and surrender to whatever came next. But survival was a stubborn thing. After the shaking passed, after he'd wiped his mouth and forced himself to breathe, Ethan began to think. The Apache had taken the horses. They'd stripped the bodies of weapons, ammunition, anything useful. But they'd left the canteens, probably because most of them were empty, or nearly so. The patrol had been 2 days out from Fort Bowie, riding through the most barren stretch of the Sonoran Desert, and water discipline had grown lax in the morning coolness. Ethan moved among the dead, trying not to look at their faces, checking every canteen. He found perhaps 2 days' worth of water if he was careful. No food except some hardtack in Morrison's saddlebag, already being investigated by ants. His own supplies had been on his horse, long gone now, with the Apache raiders. He tried to get his bearings. The sun told him it was perhaps 9 in the morning. Fort Bowie lay somewhere to the northwest. Maybe 40 miles, maybe 60. He wasn't certain. The patrol had been following a series of canyons, looking for Apache camps to burn, but Ethan had paid more attention to the card game the night before than to the sergeant's navigational lectures. Walking northwest in midsummer desert with 2 days of water and no food. The odds weren't good. But staying here with the corpses was impossible. Already the smell was becoming unbearable. By afternoon, the bodies would be bloating in the heat, and the scavengers would come. Coyotes, buzzards, maybe worse things. Ethan filled his canteen from the others, stuffed the hardtack into his pockets, and began to walk. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Broken rock, twisted sage, sand the color of old bone. The sky was a blue dome of heat that seemed to press down on his skull. Within an hour, his uniform was soaked with sweat. Within 2 hours, his lips were cracking and his tongue felt like leather. He tried to think about Philadelphia. Cool rain on cobblestones. His mother's kitchen. The Delaware River at dawn. Anything except the furnace he was walking through. Anything except the men he'd left behind to rot. But the desert wouldn't let him escape. It demanded his full attention. Every step became a negotiation with pain, blisters forming in his boots, shoulders aching from his rifle and pack, head pounding with the beginning of real heat sickness. By afternoon, he knew he'd made a terrible mistake. The rational choice would have been to wait with the bodies until nightfall, then travel in the coolness. But panic had driven him forward, and now he was paying for it. He found a sliver of shade beneath an overhang and collapsed there, rationing himself 3 small sips of water. The heat was a living thing, crushing down on him, squeezing the moisture from his body. His thoughts began to drift and scatter like smoke. Maybe he should have stayed in Philadelphia. Maybe he should have married Sarah Patterson like his mother wanted, taken over his father's hardware store, lived a safe and boring life, measuring nails and selling paint. Instead, he'd listened to the recruiting officer's stories about frontier adventure and manifest destiny and becoming a man in the wild territories. What a joke. He wasn't becoming a man. He was becoming a corpse, one slow degree at a time. When the sun finally began its descent, Ethan forced himself to stand. His legs shook and his vision swam, but he shouldered his rifle and began walking again. Northwest. Always northwest. 1 foot in front of the other, following the lengthening shadows. Night brought coolness, but also new terrors. The desert filled with sounds, scuttling things in the rocks, distant howls that might have been coyotes or something worse. Ethan walked until the moon rose, then collapsed in exhaustion and slept fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, certain that Apache warriors were creeping up to finish what the ambush had started. Dawn on the second day found him fevered and delirious. He'd drunk the last of his water during the night, and now his canteen mocked him with its empty weight. His lips were split and bleeding. His eyes felt full of sand. The landscape wavered and shimmered, playing tricks that made him see rivers where there was only stone, forests where there was only sage. He fell twice before noon. The second time, he wasn't certain he had the strength to stand again. The sun was directly overhead now, a white hammer beating him into the earth. His rifle had become impossibly heavy. He considered leaving it behind, but some stubborn part of his training refused to surrender his weapon. That was when he saw her. At first, he thought she was another hallucination, a figure standing on a ridge perhaps 50 yards away, watching him with the stillness of stone. But unlike his other visions, this one didn't waver or disappear. She remained solid, real, terrifying. Apache, had to be Apache. Dark skin, dark hair hanging loose past her shoulders, dressed in leather and cloth that blended with the desert colors. She held no visible weapon, but that meant nothing. She could kill him with a rock if she wanted, or simply watch him die of thirst. That would be easier. Ethan tried to raise his rifle. His arms wouldn't obey. The Spencer slipped from his numb fingers and clattered on the stones. The woman didn't move, just watched with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Shoot me!" Ethan croaked. His voice was barely human, a sound like gravel scraping across tin. "Just get it over with." She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity or contempt. Then she turned and began walking away. "Wait," Ethan heard himself whisper, but she was already disappearing over the ridge. Desperation gave him strength he didn't know he had. He scrambled to his feet, leaving the rifle behind, stumbling after her with the last of his dying energy. She was his enemy, yes, but she was also the only living human he'd seen in 2 days, and dying alone suddenly seemed infinitely worse than dying at Apache hands. He crested the ridge and nearly fell down the other side. The woman was perhaps 20 yards ahead, walking with unhurried grace across a slope of broken shale. She glanced back once, saw him following, and kept moving. Ethan pursued her through a maze of rock formations, barely aware of direction anymore, focused only on keeping her in sight. His vision was tunneling, darkness creeping in from the edges. He fell again, bloodying his palms on sharp stone, and when he looked up, she had stopped. She stood beside a cleft in the rock that he never would have noticed, a shadow among shadows. As Ethan watched, she knelt and disappeared into the opening. He crawled the last few yards on hands and knees, no longer caring about dignity or danger. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, leading down into darkness that promised coolness. He squeezed through, scraping his back on rough stone, and emerged into a small cave. The woman crouched on the far side, perhaps 10 feet away, watching him with the same unreadable expression. Between them, impossible and miraculous, was a small pool of water, seepage from some underground spring, no more than a few gallons, but clear and real. Ethan lunged for it. Her hand caught his wrist before he could drink, gripped like iron despite her small frame. She held him there, suspended over salvation, and spoke words in Apache that he didn't understand. Her tone was firm, but not cruel. When she released him, she mimed drinking, small sips, slow and controlled, not the desperate gulping his body screamed for. Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face, and lowered his cracked lips to the water. That first sip was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Better than wine, better than his mother's well water, better than anything he'd imagined water could be. He forced himself to drink slowly, 3 small sips, then pulled back like she'd shown him. The woman nodded approval. She produced a small leather pouch from her clothing and sprinkled something into the water, herbs, maybe, or medicine. Then she drank herself. The same small sips, the same careful control. They sat on opposite sides of the pool, 2 enemies sharing water in the desert, and Ethan understood with sudden clarity that she had saved his life. Deliberately, intentionally. She'd seen him dying and led him here instead of leaving him to the buzzards. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping she'd understand the tone. Her eyes moved to his uniform, the dusty blue coat with its cavalry insignia, the yellow kerchief that marked him as 4th Cavalry, the same unit that had been burning Apache camps and killing Apache families for the past 6 months. Her expression hardened. She spoke again in Apache, longer this time, and though Ethan couldn't translate the words, he heard the anger beneath them. She wasn't happy about saving him. She'd done it anyway, for reasons he couldn't fathom. Outside the cave, the day's heat continued to build. Inside, the temperature was bearable, almost cool. The woman settled against the far wall, drawing her knees up, watching him with the wariness of a wolf sharing space with a wounded bear. Ethan's hand drifted to his hip, where his revolver still hung in its holster. He could draw it, could put a bullet in her before she reached him, could eliminate the threat and have the water to himself. But even thinking it made him sick with shame. She'd saved him. Whatever else was true, whatever his commanders said about savages and hostiles and the necessity of frontier warfare, this woman had seen him dying and chosen mercy. He moved his hand away from the revolver and placed both palms flat on the stone in front of him, a gesture of peace, of surrender. The woman's eyes tracked the movement. Something shifted in her expression. Not trust exactly, but perhaps a lessening of immediate threat. They spent the rest of the day in that cave, sharing the small pool of water, existing in careful silence. As the fever slowly left his body and his thoughts cleared, Ethan began to truly see her for the first time. She was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe 25, maybe less. Her face was lean and hard, carved by sun and survival, but there was intelligence in her eyes that reminded him of his school teacher back in Philadelphia, Miss Reynolds, who taught him that smart didn't have anything to do with skin color or gender or which side of any war you happened to be born on. She carried no weapons that he could see, but there was a leather bag beside her that might contain anything. Her hands were scarred and calloused, marked by hard work and harder living. She wore a necklace of small stones or bones. He couldn't tell which in the dim light, and copper bracelets that caught what little sunlight filtered into the cave. As evening approached, she produced 2 small strips of dried meat from her bag and offered him one. Ethan hesitated, wondering if it might be poisoned or some kind of trap, then took it. It was tough as leather and tasted like smoke and salt, but his starving body didn't care. He chewed slowly, making it last, while she ate her portion with the same deliberate care. When darkness fell completely, she curled up against her wall and closed her eyes. Just like that. No ceremony. No negotiation about watch shifts or security. Either she trusted him not to kill her in her sleep, or she didn't care if he tried. Ethan sat with his back against the opposite wall, revolver now in his lap, and watched her breathe in the darkness. He should leave. Should take his chance to slip away while she slept, try to find the fort on his own. But he knew with bone-deep certainty that he wouldn't survive another day in the desert without her, which meant he was now dependent on the enemy for his survival. The irony was so bitter, he almost laughed. He must have dozed eventually, because he woke to find gray dawn light filtering into the cave and the woman already awake, watching him with those unreadable dark eyes. The pool had refilled slightly during the night. The spring was slow but reliable. She drank first, then gestured for him to drink. When they'd both had their ration, she stood and moved toward the cave entrance. Ethan scrambled to his feet. "Wait, where are you going?" She paused, glanced back at him, and spoke in Apache. The tone was clear enough. She was leaving, and he could follow or stay, but she wasn't asking his permission. Outside, the desert morning was cool and almost beautiful. The woman moved with purpose now, picking her way down the rocky slope with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Ethan followed, struggling to keep up, his cavalry boots clumsy on the uneven terrain compared to her light, sure-footed steps. They walked for perhaps an hour, moving through canyons and across ridges that all looked identical to Ethan but clearly meant something to her. Then she stopped abruptly and pointed. Ethan looked and saw nothing but more desert. "What? I don't—" She spoke sharply in Apache and pointed again, more emphatically. This time, Ethan squinted and thought he saw something. A darker patch in the earth, maybe. Or maybe just more rocks. His eyes weren't as good as hers. Not out here. The woman moved forward again, more carefully now, and Ethan realized she was tracking something. Reading signs in the disturbed earth and broken vegetation that were invisible to him. She knelt, touched the ground, smelled her fingers. Her face hardened. When she stood and looked at him again, her expression had changed. There was warning in her eyes now, and something that might have been fear. She spoke urgently in Apache, gesturing back the way they'd come, clearly telling him to go back to the cave. Then she started to leave without him. "No," Ethan said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "No, I'm staying with you." She turned, angry now, and unleashed a torrent of Apache words that needed no translation. She was telling him he was an idiot, that he'd get them both killed, that he needed to hide while she dealt with whatever danger she'd found. Ethan shook his head stubbornly. "I don't know the way back. I'll die out here without you, so wherever you're going, I'm going." They stared at each other for a long moment, a battle of wills between two people who couldn't speak each other's language but understood each other perfectly in that instant. Finally, she made a sound of disgust and moved forward again. But slower now, more careful, and Ethan understood she was adjusting her pace for him, teaching him how to move quietly, how to step where the ground wouldn't betray them. They crested a low rise, and Ethan saw what had alarmed her. Below, in a dried riverbed, 3 white men were making camp. They had 5 horses, more than they needed for 3 riders, and Ethan could see why.
Two of the horses carried packs bulging with supplies.
The third extra horse was unburdened, clearly meant for cargo they hadn't yet acquired. The men themselves looked hard and mean, not cavalry, not prospectors, not settlers. Their clothes were a mismatched collection of frontier gear and stolen items. One wore a cavalry jacket that was too small for him. Another had a bandolier that looked Mexican. The third was cleaning a rifle that gleamed too new and expensive for an honest man. "Bounty hunters," Ethan whispered, though he wasn't sure the woman would understand the term. She understood well enough. Her face had gone tight with something that wasn't quite fear, but was close to it. She tugged his sleeve, pulling him back down below the ridgeline. For the next hour, they lay in the dust and watched the camp below. The bounty hunters seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. They kept their rifles close and their eyes on the surrounding terrain. Twice, one of them climbed partway up a nearby rock formation to scan the desert with a spyglass. The woman beside Ethan was tense as a drawn bowstring. Her hand kept moving to her waist, where Ethan now noticed she did have a weapon after all. A small knife tucked into her belt. Easy to miss, but undoubtedly sharp. As the sun climbed higher, one of the bounty hunters produced a rolled paper from his saddlebag and spread it on a flat rock. Even from this distance, Ethan could see it was a wanted poster. The man pointed at it, then gestured broadly at the surrounding desert, and his companions nodded. They were hunting someone. And given where they'd chosen to make camp, near the water seeps and game trails that would draw any Apache trying to survive in this region, Ethan had a sinking feeling he knew who their target might be. He looked at the woman beside him. Really looked at her. Saw the way she held herself ready to run or fight. Saw the careful way she'd been avoiding open ground and keeping to the rocks. Saw, finally, the fear she'd been hiding behind that stoic mask. She wasn't just out here by chance. She was running. And he, Private Ethan Carter of the 4th Cavalry, was now lying in the dirt beside a wanted fugitive, hiding from his own countrymen, in a situation that would get him court-martialed if anyone ever found out. The woman must have sensed his realization because she looked at him then, and for the first time since they'd met, her expression was openly vulnerable. Asking a question without words, "What now? Will you betray me?" Ethan thought about the massacre, thought about his sergeant's open chest and Morrison's staring eyes, thought about Coleman dying in the dirt, begging for help that never came. Then he thought about this woman seeing him dying of thirst and choosing to save him anyway, despite the uniform he wore, despite everything his people had done to hers. He reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her arm. When she didn't pull away, he pointed at himself, then at her, then laced his fingers together. Together. "We stick together." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or weakness. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she gave a single, sharp nod. They waited until the bounty hunters settled in for an afternoon rest, then retreated carefully back the way they'd come. The woman led them on a wide detour around the camp, adding miles to their journey, but keeping them off the ridgelines where they might be spotted. By evening, they'd reached a different canyon, miles from the cave where they'd spent the previous night. Here, the woman found another seep, barely more than wet sand, and showed Ethan how to dig carefully until water began to pool. It was muddy and tasted of minerals, but it was water. They made a cold camp that night, no fire, eating the last of the dried meat and some bitter roots the woman dug from the base of a creosote bush. Ethan tried one and nearly gagged, but she gestured firmly that he should eat it, so he forced it down. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in impossible profusion overhead, Ethan finally spoke. "My name is Ethan," he said, touching his chest. "Ethan." The woman looked at him for a moment, then touched her own chest. "Naya," she said quietly. The first English word he'd heard her speak. "Naya," he repeated, and she nodded. It wasn't much, just two names exchanged in the desert darkness. But it felt like something shifting, the first step across a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for longer than either of them had been alive. Ethan leaned back against the canyon wall and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, Fort Bowie still stood. His commanding officers still gave orders. The war still raged. But here, in this small pocket of desert, none of that seemed to matter quite as much as it had before. He glanced at Naya, who sat with her knees drawn up, gazing into the darkness with an expression he couldn't read. She'd saved his life. Now he'd chosen to protect hers, at least for the moment. Where that choice would lead, He had no idea. But as he drifted towards sleep with his hand resting on his revolver and his body aching from 2 days of desert survival, Ethan Carter understood that he'd crossed a line today. He'd sided with the enemy against his own people. There would be no going back from that. The question was whether he'd live long enough to regret it. The canyon walls turned amber in the morning light, shadows retreating like living things as the sun climbed higher. Ethan woke to find Naya already awake, crouched at the edge of their camp, studying something in the distance. Her body was tense, alert, and he felt his own muscles tighten in response. "What is it?" he asked quietly, knowing she likely wouldn't understand, but needing to speak anyway. She glanced at him briefly, then pointed toward the eastern rim of the canyon. Ethan followed her gesture, but saw nothing except rock and sky. His eastern eyes were still learning to read this landscape, still struggling to find meaning in the endless variations of stone and sand. Naya made a sharp gesture. "Stay low, stay quiet." Then she was moving, quick and silent as a shadow, working her way up the canyon wall using handholds Ethan couldn't even see. He watched her climb with a mixture of admiration and frustration, acutely aware of how clumsy he was in comparison, how dependent. She reached a ledge perhaps 30 feet up and froze there, perfectly still, watching something beyond Ethan's line of sight. When she finally descended, her face was grim. "Riders?" Ethan guessed, miming someone on horseback. Naya nodded, then held up 3 fingers. The bounty hunters from yesterday, most likely, still searching these canyons for whatever prey had brought them into this desolate country. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing north and west, clearly outlining a plan. "I don't understand," Ethan said helplessly. "I'm sorry, I don't—" She cut him off with an impatient sound, grabbed his wrist, and pulled him to his feet. Her grip was strong, calloused, and she didn't let go as she led him deeper into the canyon, away from the direction she'd been watching. They moved quickly now, no longer the careful, educational pace of yesterday. This was flight. The canyon narrowed, walls closing in until they were walking through a crack barely wide enough for Ethan's shoulders. The air grew cooler, carrying the mineral smell of deep stone. Naya released his wrist but stayed close, glancing back frequently to make sure he was keeping up. They emerged into a wider space where the canyon forked in 3 directions. Naya paused, studying each option with the intensity of a gambler reading cards. Finally, she chose the middle path, but something in her hesitation told Ethan she wasn't certain. This wasn't her territory. She was navigating by instinct and desperate hope. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, though he knew she couldn't answer. "Do you have people out here? A camp?" Naya kept walking, but her shoulders had drawn tight at his questions. She understood more English than she let on, he realized. Understanding and speaking were different skills, and she was clearly better at the former. The middle fork climbed steadily upward, the path becoming a series of natural steps in the rock. Ethan's boots slipped on the smooth stone, and twice Naya had to grab his arm to keep him from falling. His cavalry training had covered mounted combat and parade formations, not rock climbing in the desert. They'd been climbing for perhaps 20 minutes when Naya suddenly froze. Her hand shot out, fingers wrapping around Ethan's wrist in a grip that made him wince. She pulled him down into a crouch behind a boulder, her other hand moving to the knife at her belt. Voices echoed from somewhere below. Men speaking English, the words distorted by distance and canyon acoustics but unmistakably hostile in tone. "Tracks lead this way, I'm telling you. Waste of time, could be anybody's tracks. $50 territorial bounty says it ain't anybody. It's Apache, and that's worth following." Ethan felt his stomach drop. The bounty hunters had found their trail. He looked at Naya and saw his own fear reflected in her eyes, though she masked it quickly behind that stoic expression she wore like armor. The voices grew closer. Ethan could hear boots scraping on stone now, the jingle of spurs, the creak of leather. 3 men, armed and motivated by money, and they were climbing the same path Ethan and Naya had just taken. Naya's fingers tightened on her knife. She looked at Ethan, and he saw the calculation in her eyes. She was measuring whether he'd fight with her or against her when the moment came, whether the uniform he wore meant more than the water they'd shared. Ethan's hand moved to his revolver. The Colt Navy felt heavy at his hip, loaded with 6 rounds he'd never fired at a living target. His mouth was dry, and it had nothing to do with the desert heat. "I'm with you," he whispered, so quietly the words were barely breath. "I'm with you." Something shifted in Naya's expression. Not quite trust, but acknowledgement. She nodded once, then turned her attention back to the approaching hunters. The voices were very close now. Ethan could make out individual words clearly. See here, scuff marks on the stone. Heading up toward the fork, probably. Careful now, could be setting up an ambush. Naya touched Ethan's shoulder, then pointed upward. Above them, the canyon wall offered a narrow ledge, barely visible, that ran along the cliff face about 15 feet up. She was already moving, finding impossible handholds in the rock, pulling herself up with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in vertical terrain. Ethan looked at the climb and felt panic surge in his chest. He'd barely managed the gentle slopes they'd been ascending. This was a sheer face with minimal holds, and one slip would mean a fatal fall onto the rocks below. But the voices were getting closer, and Naya was already on the ledge, reaching down toward him, her face urgent. He had no choice. He grabbed the first handhold she indicated and pulled himself up. His boot scraped uselessly against the smooth stone until he found a tiny crack for his toe. One hand up, testing each hold, muscles trembling with effort and fear. Naya's hand found his wrist and pulled, adding her strength to his, and somehow he was rising, inch by painful inch, until her other hand grabbed his collar and hauled him over the edge onto the ledge. They pressed themselves flat against the cliff face just as the first bounty hunter rounded the bend below. The man was perhaps 40, weathered and mean-looking, with a Spencer rifle held ready across his chest. His eyes scanned the canyon walls, missing the ledge where Ethan and Naya lay motionless above him. Two more men followed, equally armed, equally dangerous. "Trail ends here," the first man said, frustrated. "Fork goes 3 ways." "Split up," the second hunter suggested. He was younger, maybe Ethan's age, with a scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw. "Cover more ground." "And if one of us finds the Apache alone?" the third man asked. He was the oldest, grizzled and thick-bodied, with a revolver on each hip. $50 ain't worth dying for." "It ain't just 50, the scarred one said. "You see what else we could sell? Young Apache woman like that? Mexican brothels pay good money, real good money." Ethan felt Naya's body go rigid beside him. Her knife was in her hand now, knuckles white around the handle. He touched her arm gently, shaking his head. 3 armed men below, and they had the high ground, but the odds were still terrible. "We stick together," the older man decided. "Try the middle path first, looks most traveled." They started climbing, moving directly beneath the ledge where Ethan and Naya lay hidden. Ethan held his breath, certain they'd be spotted, certain this was where everything would end in blood and violence. The hunters passed within 6 feet of them, close enough that Ethan could smell tobacco and sweat, could see the silver conchos on the older man's belt. One of them paused directly below, looking around with narrowed eyes, and Ethan was sure they were caught. But the man's gaze slid past the ledge, fooled by shadow and angle, and he kept climbing. The 3 bounty hunters disappeared around another bend, their voices fading as the canyon swallowed them. Naya and Ethan remained frozen on their ledge for several long minutes, scarcely breathing. Finally, Naya touched his shoulder and pointed back the way they'd come. Going down would be easier than climbing up had been, though not by much. They descended carefully, and once Ethan's boots touched solid ground again, his legs nearly buckled with relief. Naya was already moving back toward the fork, choosing the left-hand path this time, the one the hunters had dismissed. This route led down instead of up, winding through increasingly narrow passages until they emerged into a different canyon system entirely. Here, scraggly mesquite trees clung to life near a dry wash, and the remains of an old flood had left driftwood scattered like bones across the sand. Naya found shade beneath an overhang and finally stopped, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion she'd been hiding. Ethan collapsed beside her, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the relative coolness of the shaded stone. "That was too close," he said, more to himself than to her. "Those men, what they said they'd do." Naya's eyes met his, and he saw she'd understood every word the bounty hunters had spoken. The threat hadn't been abstract to her. It was a reality she lived with every day, the knowledge that her body was currency in a market that saw her people as less than human. Ethan felt something break open inside his chest, a barrier he'd been carrying since basic training, since the recruiting officer's speeches. since every lesson he'd absorbed about civilization and savagery. Those men below weren't fighting for freedom or manifest destiny. They were hunting a woman for money, and worse. And he'd almost been one of them. Would have been, if the ambush had gone differently, if his commanders had ordered it, if he'd never been forced to see the enemy as anything other than targets to shoot at. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for all of it, for what they want to do, for what my people have done." Naya looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched the cavalry insignia on his collar, the crossed sabers that marked him as 4th Cavalry. Her fingers traced the metal slowly, deliberately. "Soldiers," she said in heavily accented English. "Kill my family." The words hit Ethan like physical blows. He stared at her, at the pain she was revealing, and understood suddenly why she'd hesitated before saving him, why she'd looked at his uniform with such barely controlled rage. "I didn't," he started to say, then stopped. It didn't matter if he personally had killed her family. He wore the uniform. He was part of the machine that had destroyed her world. "I didn't know," he finished lamely. "You know now," Naya said. Her English was rough but clear enough, each word chosen carefully. "Still help me?" It was a test, Ethan realized. Maybe the final one. She was giving him an out, a chance to return to his own people, to the safety of the fort and the rightness of the uniform. All he had to do was leave her here, walk away, and pretend the last 3 days had never happened. Instead, he unpinned the cavalry insignia from his collar and held it in his palm. The crossed sabers gleamed in the filtered sunlight. Then, deliberately, he threw it as hard as he could. The insignia bounced off canyon walls and disappeared into the sand. "I help you," he said. "No more soldier." Naya studied him with those dark, intelligent eyes, searching for deception or weakness. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded and pulled a small leather pouch from her belt. Inside were strips of dried meat and what looked like pemmican, more food than he'd seen her carry before. She'd been rationing it, he realized, saving it for when she was alone again. But now she divided it evenly between them, and they ate in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher and the desert beyond their shelter began to shimmer with heat. "Where were you going?" Ethan asked after a while. "Before you found me. You were traveling alone. You must have had a destination." Naya was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she pointed northwest. "Mountains," she said. "My people. Some left. Hidden." "How far?" She held up both hands, fingers spread, then repeated the gesture twice more. 30-something. 30 miles? 30 days? He wasn't sure. "We go together," he said. It wasn't a question. Naya nodded slowly. "Together," she agreed. The word was awkward in her mouth, but she said it with conviction. They rested through the worst heat of the day, taking turns keeping watch. When evening began to soften the harsh angles of the landscape, they set out again, moving northwest through terrain that grew gradually rougher and more broken. As darkness fell, Naya led them to a cluster of boulders that formed a natural shelter. They made another cold camp, chewing on the pemmican and sipping carefully from a small seep Naya found by scraping away sand until moisture appeared. "Tell me about your family," Ethan said into the darkness. "If you want to, if the words come." Naya was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't respond. Then her voice came, soft and halting in the night air. "Father, mother, 2 brothers, little sister." Each word was carefully formed, pulled from limited English vocabulary. "Soldiers come winter, snow on ground, we sleeping." She paused, and Ethan heard her breathing change, become shallower. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to continue, but he sensed she needed to speak this, needed to make him understand. "Rifles, many rifles. Father try fight, die first. Mother run with sister, shot in back." Naya's voice remained flat, emotionless, as if she was reading someone else's story. "Brothers fight, die. I hide in rocks, watch everything." "How long ago?" Ethan asked quietly. 2 winters? 2 years she'd been running, hiding, surviving alone in country that was hostile to her people in every way. 2 years since she'd watched soldiers, maybe men he'd trained with, eaten with, considered brothers, murder her family in their sleep. The bounty, Ethan said, understanding now. They're hunting you specifically. Naya nodded in the darkness. Kill soldiers after. 3 soldiers. They were... She struggled for the word, made a gesture Ethan couldn't quite interpret. Hurting Apache woman. Not kill quick, like father. Slow, laughing. You killed them, Ethan said. Not a question. Yes, with knife, slow like they do to her. There was no regret in Naya's voice, no shame. They put paper with my face, $50, dead or alive. $50 territorial bounty. And whatever else the bounty hunters thought they could sell her for. Ethan felt sick thinking about those men below, about what they'd planned, about how close Naya lived to that fate every single day. The woman you saved, he asked, the one they were hurting, did she live? No, too much hurt. I stay with her. She die at sunrise. Naya's voice softened slightly. I bury her, say words, not leave for animals. They sat in silence after that, 2 people from opposite sides of a brutal war, learning that the lines between good and evil were far less clear than the recruiting officers and tribal elders had promised. The next 3 days fell into a harsh rhythm. They traveled at night when possible, hiding during the day when the sun turned the desert into an anvil. Naya taught Ethan how to read the land, how to find water in places that looked bone dry, how to move without leaving obvious tracks. She was patient with his stumbling attempts to learn, correcting him with gestures when words failed. In return, Ethan shared what little he had, his better knife for cutting, his flint for making the occasional small fire when they were certain no one could see the smoke. He tried to teach her more English, and she taught him Apache words for essential things. Water, danger, friend. The language lessons were halting and often comical, but they created a bridge between their worlds. On the 4th day of their journey together, they encountered the soldiers. It was mid-afternoon, and they'd been forced to travel during daylight hours to reach the next reliable water source before dark. Naya spotted them first, freezing in mid-step and pulling Ethan down behind a screen of creosote brush. A cavalry patrol, 8 men strong, watering their horses at the same spring Naya had been leading them toward. Ethan recognized the unit markings. 7th Cavalry, out of Fort Apache, technically allies to his own 4th Cavalry Regiment. We go different way, Naya whispered, already backing away from the brush. Wait! Ethan caught her arm. Those are soldiers. Regular army, not bounty hunters. I could talk to them, explain that you helped me survive the ambush. They might what? Naya's English was getting better daily, especially when she was angry. Give medal. Say thank you. She pointed at her face, her skin, the leather clothing that marked her as Apache. They see enemy. Only enemy. You don't know that, Ethan argued, though part of him suspected she was right. Some soldiers are decent men. If I explained... A shout from the spring cut him off. One of the cavalrymen had spotted movement in the brush, and now rifles were coming up, aimed in their direction. Come out slow, the sergeant called. Hands where we can see them. Ethan stood carefully, hands raised, stepping out from behind the creosote. Don't shoot! I'm Private Ethan Carter, 4th Cavalry, out of Fort Bowie. The rifles didn't lower. The sergeant, a hard-faced man in his 40s, gestured sharply. Step into the open. Slow. Ethan obeyed, acutely aware of Naya still hidden behind him. My patrol was ambushed 5 days ago. Apache raiders, everyone killed except me. I've been trying to make it back to... Where's your uniform jacket? The sergeant interrupted. Your insignia? Ethan looked down at himself. He'd discarded the cavalry coat days ago when the heat became unbearable, keeping only his sweat-stained shirt and kerchief. Had to leave it. The heat. Who else is with you? The sergeant's eyes had gone cold and calculating. We saw 2 people in them bushes. Ethan's mouth went dry. Behind him, he heard the faint sound of movement. Naya trying to slip away while the soldiers were focused on him. But these were experienced frontier troops, and 2 of them were already moving to flank the position. Nobody, Ethan said. You're seeing things. Desert plays tricks. Found her! One of the flanking soldiers called out triumphantly. There was a brief struggle. Then he emerged dragging Naya by her arm. She didn't fight, didn't resist, just went limp and passive in his grip. But her eyes found Ethan's, and the betrayal he saw there cut deeper than any knife. The sergeant's rifle swung to cover Naya. Well now, Apache woman, traveling with a soldier who's lost his uniform. That's an interesting story, Private Carter. She saved my life, Ethan said quickly. Found me dying of thirst after the ambush, led me to water, kept me alive. I owe her— You owe her nothing, the sergeant spat. She's Apache, probably scouted for the same raiders who killed your patrol. He turned to his men. Bind her hands. We'll take her back to Fort Apache. No. Ethan stepped forward. She's done nothing wrong. She's not a raider. She's a hostile in unceded territory, the sergeant cut him off. That's enough. His eyes narrowed as he studied Ethan more carefully. And you might want to think hard about your story, Private. Traveling alone with an Apache woman, no uniform, no weapon. I have my revolver, which you didn't draw when you saw 8 armed soldiers. That's curious behavior. The sergeant's voice had gone dangerous and soft. Makes a man wonder if maybe you weren't ambushed at all. Makes him wonder if maybe you deserted, found yourself a squaw to keep you company. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The other soldiers were watching Ethan now with hostile eyes, hands on their weapons. He was one word away from being bound alongside Naya, one wrong move from being shot as a deserter. My entire patrol was massacred, Ethan said, forcing his voice to stay level. Lieutenant Morrison, Sergeant Hayes, Private Coleman, and 12 others. You can ride to the site and see the bodies if you don't believe me. I survived because I hid like a coward while my brothers died. This woman found me 3 days later and saved my life. That's the truth. The sergeant considered this. Location of the massacre? Ethan described it as best he could. The canyon, the boulder field, the direction they'd been traveling. The sergeant nodded slowly. We'll verify your story when we return to Fort Apache. Until then, you're coming with us. And the Apache stays bound. He gestured to his men. Mount up. We've got a long ride ahead. They tied Naya's hands in front of her and put her on one of the spare horses. She sat straight-backed and silent, her face a mask. But Ethan saw the rapid pulse in her throat, the tension in her shoulders. She was terrified, and he'd led her straight into this trap by insisting they could trust his fellow soldiers. The patrol rode northwest, making good time now that they had horses. Ethan rode beside Naya, trying to catch her eye, trying to convey apology or reassurance or something, but she refused to look at him. She'd gone somewhere else inside herself, somewhere he couldn't reach. They made camp that evening in a small canyon. The soldiers built a fire and broke out rations, talking and laughing among themselves. Naya was tied to a tree on the edge of camp, her hands still bound and given no food or water. Ethan approached the sergeant. She needs to eat and water. Apache don't need much, the sergeant said dismissively. They're used to going without. She's a human being. She needs— What she needs, the sergeant interrupted, his voice hardening, is none of your concern, Private. You want my advice? Stop acting like her friend. When we get to Fort Apache, there's going to be questions about why you were traveling with her instead of trying to reach the nearest fort. The more you defend her, the worse those questions are going to get. It was a warning and a threat combined. Ethan understood that his own survival now depended on distancing himself from Naya, on treating her like the enemy the army needed her to be. He returned to the fire and accepted his portion of salt pork and hardtack, but the food turned to ash in his mouth. Across the camp, Naya sat with her back against the tree, eyes closed, face composed. She looked small and vulnerable in a way she never had in the desert, and Ethan understood that putting her in bonds had been about more than preventing escape. It had been about stripping away her dignity, reminding everyone present that she was property now, not a person. When full darkness fell and the soldiers began settling into their bedrolls, Ethan waited until the sergeant posted guards, then carefully worked his way around the camp to where Naya was tied. The guard on this side was young, barely older than Ethan, and had already started to doze against a rock. Ethan knelt beside Naya, her eyes opened immediately, alert despite her stillness. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought they'd listen. You thought your people see me like you see me," Naya interrupted, her English clearer than he'd ever heard it. "But they never will. I am not person to them, just enemy, just animal. That's not true. Some of them is true." Her eyes were fierce now, burning in the firelight. You see different because desert make you need me. Take away desert, you same as them. The words hit him like a slap. No, I've changed. I know what I was taught was wrong. Then prove it, Naya said. Cut rope. Let me run. Ethan glanced back at the camp. The dozing guard was still motionless. The others were settling in, but not yet asleep. If he cut her bonds now, she might make it 20 yards before someone noticed. Maybe not even that far. They'll shoot you, he said, before you get 10 steps. Maybe, but I die free. Not in cage at fort. She leaned forward, and her whisper was urgent. You know what they do at forts to Apache women? You know? Ethan did know. He'd heard the stories, the jokes, the casual cruelty that soldiers pretended was justice. He'd laughed along with them once, back when Apache meant abstract enemy and not this woman who'd saved his life. His hand moved to the knife at his belt, then stopped. If he freed her and she was caught, they'd both die. If he freed her and she escaped, he'd hang for it. Everything he'd been raised to believe about duty and honor and following orders screamed at him to leave her bound, to trust the system, to believe that justice would somehow prevail. But he'd already thrown away his insignia, already chosen her side when he hid from the bounty hunters. The only question was whether he had the courage to follow through. Wait until the guard change, he whispered finally. 2 hours before dawn, I'll be on watch. When I signal, run north. There's broken country that way. You can lose them in the rocks. You die for this, Naya said. It wasn't a question. Maybe. Probably. Ethan tried to smile and failed. But you said it yourself. I'm not the same person I was. Desert changed me. You changed me. Why? Naya's voice had softened slightly. Why you risk everything? I am nothing. Enemy. You're not nothing, Ethan said fiercely. And you're not my enemy. You're the person who showed me that everything I believed about this war was a lie. They looked at each other in the darkness. Two people from opposite sides of a brutal conflict, connected by something neither of them had words for. Not quite friendship, not yet love, but something profound that had been forged in shared survival and the slow collapse of their certainties. Ethan returned to the fire before anyone could question his absence. The hours until his watch shift crawled past with agonizing slowness. He lay in his bedroll, pretending to sleep, mind racing through every possible outcome of what he was about to do. Finally, the sergeant shook him awake for the pre-dawn watch. Ethan took up his position, rifle in hand, and waited until the camp had settled back into silence. The other guard was posted on the opposite side, barely visible in the dying firelight. Ethan moved carefully to where Naya waited. Her eyes opened as he approached, and he saw she'd been awake all along, waiting to see if he'd keep his word. He cut her bonds with 2 quick strokes of his knife. She rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed them raw, then touched his hand briefly, a gesture of thanks or farewell, or something else entirely. Go, he breathed, fast and quiet. Don't look back. Naya nodded once, then melted into the darkness like smoke. Ethan watched her disappear among the rocks, then settled back into his guard position. His heart was hammering so hard he was certain the entire camp could hear it. He'd give her 20 minutes, he decided, long enough to get clear. Then he'd raise the alarm, claim she'd somehow worked her bonds loose, take whatever punishment came. It was the least he could do. But fate had other plans. The dozing guard from earlier, apparently feeling guilty about his lapse, decided to make a circuit of the camp to prove his diligence. He reached Naya's tree, saw the cut ropes, and immediately shouted, "The Apache's escaped! She's gone!" The camp exploded into action. Soldiers scrambling for rifles, the sergeant shouting orders, someone kicking the fire into brightness. And all eyes turned to Ethan, standing guard on the side where Naya had been held. "You were supposed to be watching," the sergeant roared, striding toward him. "How did she—" He stopped, seeing something in Ethan's face. "You let her go. You cut her loose." There was no point in lying. Ethan met the sergeant's furious gaze steadily. "She saved my life. I owed her the same chance." The sergeant's fist caught him across the jaw, and Ethan went down hard, tasting blood. "You stupid, soft-hearted fool. She's Apache, the enemy, and you just committed treason for her." "She's a person," Ethan said thickly, spitting blood. "More human than any of you." The sergeant kicked him in the ribs, and pain exploded through Ethan's chest. "Get him bound. We're taking him back to face charges. The rest of you mount up. We've got a fugitive to catch." They bound Ethan's hands behind his back and threw him across a horse like a sack of grain. As the patrol rode out in pursuit of Naya, Ethan twisted his head enough to see the direction they were heading, north, into the broken country he'd told her to run toward. She had maybe a 20-minute lead, on foot, against 8 mounted soldiers, but she was Apache, and this was her land. If anyone could disappear into that hostile terrain, it was her. Ethan closed his eyes and prayed to whatever gods might listen that she'd make it, that his sacrifice wouldn't be for nothing. The desert stretched endlessly before them, swallowing secrets and keeping its silence. And somewhere out there in the darkness, a woman ran for her freedom while a soldier faced the consequences of choosing mercy over orders. The pursuit lasted 3 hours before the soldiers lost her trail in a maze of slot canyons where the stone was too hard to hold tracks. Ethan listened to the sergeant's increasingly furious orders, heard the frustration in the men's voices as they realized their quarry had vanished like smoke and wind. They'd underestimated her, treated the hunt like chasing down a frightened deer instead of tracking someone who'd spent 2 years surviving in country that killed white men in days. When they finally gave up and turned back toward Fort Apache, the sergeant's rage found its natural target. He rode up beside Ethan's horse and grabbed him by the hair, yanking his head back. "She's gone because of you," the sergeant hissed. $50 bounty and whatever reward the territory was offering all vanished into the desert because you decided to play hero for a savage. Ethan said nothing. His ribs throbbed where the sergeant had kicked him, and his wrists were raw from the ropes, but he felt something close to peace settling in his chest. Naya was free. Whatever happened to him now, at least he'd done that one thing right. "You'll hang for this," the sergeant continued. "Aiding the enemy, dereliction of duty, maybe desertion depending on how the inquiry goes. They'll put a rope around your neck and drop you in front of the whole garrison as an example." "Maybe," Ethan said quietly, "but I'd do it again." The sergeant's fist caught him across the mouth, splitting his lip. Blood ran down Ethan's chin and soaked into his already filthy shirt. But he didn't cry out. He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and there was strange freedom in that finality. They rode through the day and into the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. The soldiers treated Ethan like contaminated cargo, refusing to speak to him, giving him water only when the sergeant ordered it. By the time Fort Apache's walls appeared on the horizon 2 days later, Ethan was half dead from thirst and the infection starting in his cracked ribs. The fort was smaller than Bowie, a collection of adobe buildings surrounded by a wooden stockade that looked like it would barely stop a determined dog, much less a Apache raiding party. But it had a guardhouse with iron bars, and that's where they threw Ethan after the sergeant made his report to the commanding officer. Captain Wheeler was a thin, hawk-faced man with eyes like chips of flint. He studied Ethan through the bars of the cell with the expression of someone examining a particularly disappointing piece of equipment. "Private Carter," Wheeler said, his voice clipped and Eastern. "The sergeant tells me you freed a hostile prisoner and allowed her to escape. Is this accurate?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said. There was no point in lying. "Why?" It was a simple question with no simple answer. Ethan thought about everything that had happened since the ambush, about dying of thirst and sharing water, about bounty hunters and terrible choices, about a woman who'd saved his life despite every reason not to. "Because it was the right thing to do, sir," he said finally. Wheeler's expression didn't change. "The right thing. I see. And did it occur to you, Private, that this woman might have scouted for the same raiders who killed your patrol? That by freeing her you might have enabled future attacks on American soldiers?" "She didn't scout for them, sir. She was running from bounty hunters. She'd been alone in the desert for—" "I didn't ask for her life story," Wheeler cut him off. "I asked if you considered the tactical implications of your actions." Ethan fell silent. In the captain's world, everything was tactics and strategy, assets and threats. There was no room for the messy reality of shared water and slowly dissolving certainties. "You'll be held here pending a formal inquiry," Wheeler continued. "Given the severity of the charges, I expect you'll be transferred to Fort Bowie for court-martial within the week. In the meantime, you'll speak to no one about this incident. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." Wheeler turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Private, the sergeant tells me your story about the ambush checks out. We found the massacre site, verified the casualties. Under different circumstances, you might have been commended for your survival. His voice hardened. Instead, you'll likely hang. What a waste. The captain left, and Ethan was alone with the flies and the heat and the throbbing pain in his ribs. A guard brought him water and a plate of beans that evening, but Ethan could barely eat. His body was failing him, infection spreading from the cracked ribs, fever starting to burn behind his eyes. He drifted in and out of consciousness over the next 2 days, sometimes certain he was back in the desert dying of thirst, sometimes convinced Naya was in the cell with him, speaking in Apache and English mixed together until the languages became one. Once, he woke to find a post surgeon examining his ribs, but the man's face kept morphing into the sergeant's, into Captain Wheeler's, into the bounty hunters who'd wanted to sell Naya like livestock. On the third day, Ethan woke to find he wasn't alone. A man sat on the floor across from him, watching with patient eyes. Not a soldier. His clothes were civilian, dusty trail gear that had seen hard use. He was perhaps 50, with silver in his beard and scars that suggested a violent history.
"You're awake," the man said. His voice was surprisingly gentle. "Good. Wasn't sure you'd make it. That infection's got its teeth in you pretty deep." Ethan tried to sit up and failed. "Who are you?" "Name's Frank Dalton. I'm a territorial marshal, or I was until I got tired of enforcing laws I didn't believe in." He pulled out a canteen and held it to Ethan's lips. "Drink slow. Your gut's probably forgotten how to handle water."
Ethan drank, the cool liquid like salvation on his cracked throat. "Why are you here?" "Because I heard an interesting story about a cavalry private who freed an Apache woman and got himself arrested for it. Made me curious." Dalton set the canteen aside and studied Ethan with those patient eyes. "You know who she was? The woman you freed?" "Her name was Naya." "Is Naya. Don't talk about her like she's dead." Dalton smiled faintly. "She's got a reputation in these parts. Killed 3 soldiers 2 years back who were doing things to a Chiricahua woman that I won't repeat. Territory put a bounty on her, but she's smart and fast, and nobody's collected yet." "She told me about it," Ethan said. "About her family, about what happened." "And you believed her? Apache woman telling stories about evil white soldiers?" "I saw enough to know the stories are true," Ethan said. "The bounty hunters who were tracking her, they weren't looking to bring her in for justice. They wanted—" He stopped, the memory of what they'd said making him feel sick. "I know what they wanted," Dalton said quietly. "Same thing men always want when they see women as property instead of people. This frontier's got a lot of blood on it, son, and not all of it's been shed in honest battle." Ethan looked at the former marshal carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because in 2 days, a detachment from Fort Bowie is coming to transfer you for court-martial. And I'm betting they'll convict you and hang you within a week of arrival, because the Army needs to make an example out of anyone who shows mercy to the enemy." Dalton leaned forward. "But there's another option." "I'm listening." "Tonight, the guard rotation changes at midnight. Young private named Russell pulls the graveyard shift, and Russell owes me a favor from when I kept him out of jail for cheating at cards in Tucson. He'll be looking the other way when you leave." Ethan's fever-dulled mind struggled to process this. "You're offering to help me escape? Why?" "Because I've been watching this war for 15 years, and I'm tired of seeing good people destroyed by it." Dalton's voice was soft but fierce. "White, Apache, Mexican, doesn't matter. The frontier chews up anyone with a conscience and spits out monsters. You still got your conscience intact, which makes you rare as gold out here. If I run, I'll be a deserter, a fugitive. I'll never be able to go home." "You think you've got a home to go back to? You freed an Apache woman. That makes you a traitor in the eyes of every white settlement from here to California." Dalton stood, brushing dust from his pants. "But if you head west into the mountains, there's places a man can disappear. Places where the war hasn't reached yet, where people are too busy surviving to care what uniform you used to wear." "The woman," Ethan said. "Naya. Do you know where she went?" Dalton's expression shifted, became carefully neutral. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I owe her my life, because she's alone out there with bounty hunters and soldiers both hunting her, because—" Ethan stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Because you care about her," Dalton finished. "Not just debt, not just obligation. You actually care." Ethan nodded slowly. "Well then." Dalton moved toward the cell door, then paused. "There's a settlement 3 days northwest of here, right on the edge of the Mogollon Rim, place called Redemption, though the name's mostly wishful thinking. It's where people go when they've run out of other options. If I was an Apache woman trying to disappear, that's where I'd head. Mixed population, no law to speak of, and everybody's running from something. How do I find it? Follow the high country northwest until you hit the rim. Settlements in a canyon, hidden unless you know what to look for. Ask for a woman named Sarah Ming. Tell her Frank Dalton sent you and she'll know you're all right." Dalton knocked on the cell door and the guard, a different one than usual, came to let him out. Before leaving, the former marshal turned back one last time. "One more thing, son. The world you're walking into, it doesn't forgive mistakes. Apache, white, whoever you meet, they're all going to judge you by what you do, not what you meant to do. You understand that?" "I do," Ethan said. "Good. Then maybe you'll survive long enough to find her." The guard locked the cell behind Dalton, and Ethan was alone again with his fever and his choices. He dozed fitfully through the afternoon, waking occasionally to sip water and eat a few bites of the bread someone had left. By evening, the infection had pushed his temperature higher, and he could feel himself sliding toward delirium again. But when midnight came, he was awake and alert, crouched by the cell door. The guard changed exactly as Dalton had promised, and the young private named Russell appeared, looking nervous and guilty. "I ain't doing this because I like you," Russell whispered as he unlocked the cell. "I'm doing it because Frank Dalton saved my skin and I owe him. But if you get caught, I'll swear I don't know nothing about how you escaped." "Fair enough," Ethan said. Russell handed him a worn coat that had no military markings, a hat with a brim wide enough to hide his face, and a small pack with supplies. "There's food for 3 days, a canteen, and a knife. No gun. I couldn't get one without raising questions. You'll have to manage without." "Thank you," Ethan said. "Don't thank me. Just go before I change my mind." Ethan slipped out of the guardhouse into the fort's darkened interior. Most of the garrison was asleep, but there were still sentries on the walls and patrols moving through the compound. He kept to the shadows, moving slowly, using everything Naya had taught him about becoming invisible. The stockade wall had a gap near the southeastern corner where erosion had undercut the foundation. Ethan squeezed through, scraping his infected ribs and biting down on a scream as pain lanced through his chest. Then he was outside, stumbling into the desert night, a fugitive from the only world he'd ever known. He walked northwest, using the stars to navigate like Naya had shown him. His fever made the landscape waver and shift, turning rocks into crouching figures and shadows into pursuers. More than once he fell and had to force himself back to his feet, knowing that stopping meant death. Dawn found him miles from the fort, collapsed beside a dry wash, too weak to go further. The infection was winning, turning his blood to fire, and he knew with dull certainty that he'd die out here unless he found help. That's when he heard the horses. Ethan forced his eyes open and saw 3 riders approaching. Not soldiers. They lacked the uniform precision of a cavalry patrol. But not honest travelers either. They had the hard, predatory look of men who lived by violence. "Well, look what we got here," the lead rider said, dismounting. He was the scarred man from before, one of the bounty hunters who'd been tracking Naya. "Thought you looked familiar. You're that soldier from the canyon, the one traveling with the Apache woman." Ethan tried to stand and couldn't. His legs wouldn't obey, and the world was tilting sideways. "He's burning up," another bounty hunter observed, the older one with 2 revolvers. "Probably won't last the day." "Shame," the scarred man said, "because he's worth money to us. Dead or alive, the army pays for deserters. Not much, but more than nothing." He drew his revolver and aimed it at Ethan's head. "Any last words, soldier boy?" Ethan closed his eyes, too tired to be afraid. He'd done what he'd set out to do. Naya was free, and that had to be enough. The gunshot split the morning air. Ethan waited for pain that didn't come. When he opened his eyes, the scarred bounty hunter was on the ground, bleeding from his chest. The other 2 men were scrambling for their weapons, shouting in confusion. Another shot, and the older hunter went down. The 3rd man managed to draw his rifle before a final shot caught him in the throat and he collapsed, choking on his own blood. Silence fell across the desert. Then, from behind a rock formation 30 yards away, A figure emerged. Naya walked toward him with her knife in one hand and a rifle, taken from one of the dead hunters, in the other. She looked wild and dangerous, her hair loose around her shoulders, dried blood on her clothes that wasn't hers. But her eyes, when they met Ethan's, were soft with something he couldn't name. "You came back," he whispered. "I told you to run." "You stupid man," Naya said, kneeling beside him. Her hands were gentle as they checked his wounds, but her voice was fierce. "You cut my rope. Risk everything. You think I leave you?" "You should have. I'm not worth—" "You worth everything," Naya interrupted. Her English had improved even in their few days apart, or maybe the fever was making it easier for him to understand. "You choose me over your people, your uniform, your safety. Nobody do that before." She pulled him upright despite his protests and got him onto one of the dead hunter's horses. The movement sent agony through his cracked ribs, and he nearly passed out, but Naya kept him in the saddle through sheer force of will. "Where are we going?" Ethan managed to ask. "Place for people like us," Naya said, swinging up onto another horse. "People who don't fit, who run from war." She looked at him, and he saw understanding in her eyes. "Redemption." "How did you know about—" "Old Marshall find me 2 days ago. Say soldier boy going to hang unless he run. Say you probably try find me, get yourself killed." She almost smiled. "He right." They rode northwest through country that grew steadily rougher and more beautiful. The desert gave way to juniper and pine, and the land lifted toward distant mountains that wore clouds like crowns. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of Naya beside him, her hand occasionally reaching over to steady him when he started to slip from the saddle. On the second day, the fever broke. Ethan woke clear-headed for the first time in a week, lying on a bedroll under pine trees with Naya tending a small fire nearby. She'd stripped off his infected bandages and packed the wound with some kind of poultice that smelled of sage and other things he couldn't identify. "You're a healer," he said, his voice raspy but stronger. "Mother teach me," Naya said. "Before soldiers kill her. She know plants, no medicine. I remember some." "Thank you. For coming back, for saving me." Naya looked at him across the fire. "You saved me first. Cut rope. Risk life. We even now. Is that all this is? Keeping score?" She was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "Not score. Something else. Don't have words for it." She touched her chest, over her heart. "Here, feels strange, like—" She struggled, searching her limited English for the right description. "Like when you find water in desert, relief, happiness, but also fear, because water can disappear." Ethan understood exactly what she meant. He felt it too, this fragile thing growing between them, too new to name, too precious to examine too closely in case it vanished like a desert mirage. They reached Redemption on the evening of the third day. The settlement was hidden in a box canyon just like Dalton had described, invisible until you were practically on top of it. It was a chaotic collection of adobe buildings, tents, and lean-tos, populated by the human wreckage of the frontier wars, deserters from both the Army and Apache tribes, Mexican refugees, Chinese laborers who'd escaped the railroad camps, former slaves heading west from Texas, and outlaws of every description. A woman met them at the canyon entrance, rifle held loosely but ready. She was Chinese, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd survived things that would have broken lesser people. "Frank sent us," Ethan said. "Said to ask for Sarah Ming." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Any friend of Frank's gets a chance to prove they're worth trusting. But just a chance. You cause trouble here, you'll find yourself back in the desert with a bullet in your spine." "We're not looking for trouble," Ethan said. "Just a place to rest, to figure out what comes next." Sarah studied them. A white deserter and an Apache fugitive, both wanted by the law, both carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh. "You're running from something," she observed. "Everyone here is. Question is, are you running toward something too, or just running?" Ethan looked at Naya, and she looked back at him. In her eyes, he saw the same question he'd been asking himself since the moment he threw away his cavalry insignia. Could two people from opposite sides of a brutal war find something worth building together? Or were they just delaying the inevitable, postponing the moment when the violence caught up to them? "We're figuring that out," Ethan said honestly. Sarah nodded slowly. Fair enough. Come on then. I'll show you where you can sleep. Tomorrow, if you want to stay, you'll work. Everyone here works. No free rides and redemption. She led them into the settlement where cook fires were being lit against the gathering darkness and the smell of beans and coffee mixed with pine smoke. People watched them pass, wary, curious, but not openly hostile. They'd all been refugees once, all been hunted, all been forced to choose between death and dishonor. Sarah showed them to a small adobe building at the edge of the settlement. It's not much, but it's dry and the roof doesn't leak. There's a well for water and you can take meals in the common house until you get on your feet. Thank you, Naya said. Her English was clear enough now that Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. You speak better than most of the whites here, Sarah observed. You've been learning. Had good teacher, Naya said, glancing at Ethan. He teach me words. I teach him desert. Sounds like a fair trade. Sarah moved toward the door, then paused. Word of advice. Redemption's safer than most places for people like you, but it's not safe. Bounty hunters come through sometimes, soldiers on patrol, lawmen looking for fugitives. You'll want to take watches at night, keep weapons close. And if trouble comes, the community bell will ring 3 times. That means everyone grabs what they can carry and heads for the canyon tunnels in the North Cliff. We've got escape routes planned, supplies cached, because the one thing we all know here is that sooner or later, the war finds everyone. After Sarah left, Ethan and Naya stood in their small shelter, looking at the single room that represented their entire world now. A bedroll on the floor, a small stove in the corner, walls of mud brick that were already releasing the day's heat. Not much, Naya said quietly. It's everything, Ethan replied. It's the first place I've felt safe since the ambush. Naya touched his hand, her fingers rough and warm. You safe with me, she said. I keep you safe. You keep me safe, like in desert. Like in the desert, Ethan agreed. They settled in as darkness fell completely, sharing a simple meal of bread and dried meat that Sarah had left for them. Outside, the settlement gradually quieted, voices fading into the night sounds of the canyon. Somewhere, a child was crying, and Ethan heard a woman singing a lullaby in Spanish. Normal sounds. Human sounds. The kind of sounds he'd almost forgotten existed in a world defined by violence and fear. Naya lay down on the bedroll, and after a moment's hesitation, Ethan lay beside her. Not touching, maintaining a careful distance, but close enough to feel her warmth, to hear her breathing slow and steady as sleep began to claim her. Ethan, she said into the darkness, what you said to Captain, about right thing. You still believe? He thought about everything that had happened, about the men he'd killed and the uniform he'd abandoned, about laws he'd broken and loyalties he'd betrayed. By every measure he'd been taught to value, he'd failed completely. He was a deserter, a traitor, a man without country or honor. But he'd also saved a life that the world had deemed worthless. He'd chosen mercy over obedience, humanity over hatred. And lying here in this small adobe room with a woman who should have been his enemy but had become something infinitely more important, he felt more like himself than he ever had in a cavalry uniform. Yes, he said, I still believe it was right. Naya's hand found his in the darkness and held it. Good, she whispered. Because tomorrow, maybe we figure out how to live in a world that think we wrong. Together, Ethan said. Together, Naya agreed. And in that moment, despite everything they'd lost and everything they'd have to face, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since before the ambush. Something that might have been hope, or might have been the beginning of whatever came after hope, when you'd seen the worst the world could offer and chosen to believe in better anyway. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them. But inside their shelter, 2 people from opposite sides of a brutal war held hands in the darkness and dared to imagine a future that neither side would have allowed them to have. Morning came with the sound of hammers and voices, redemption waking to another day of survival. Ethan rose stiffly, his ribs still tender but healing, and found Naya already awake, standing in the doorway watching the settlement come to life. They build something, she said, pointing toward the center of the canyon where a group of men were raising timber frames. New house, maybe? Or a barn, Ethan suggested, moving to stand beside her. Looks big enough for livestock. A knock interrupted them. Sarah Ming stood outside with a basket of bread and a clay jug of milk. "Breakfast," she said. "And after you eat, come find me. We need to talk about how you'll earn your keep." They ate quickly, the bread still warm and surprisingly good, then followed Sarah's directions to a large building that served as the settlement's store and meeting hall. Inside, they found her inventorying supplies with the help of a young Mexican boy who couldn't have been more than 12. "This is Miguel," Sarah said. "He helps me keep track of what we have and what we need. Miguel, this is Ethan and Naya. They'll be staying with us for a while." The boy studied them with old eyes. "You're the ones everyone's talking about, the deserter and the Apache." It wasn't accusatory, just stating facts. "News travels fast," Ethan said. "In a place this small, everything travels fast." Sarah set down her ledger and looked at them seriously. "I'll be direct. Redemption survives because everyone contributes. We farm what we can in the canyon bottom, hunt in the mountains, trade with the few merchants brave enough to come this far off the regular trails. What can you two offer?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he offer? He'd been trained to kill Apache and follow orders. Neither skill seemed useful in a settlement dedicated to escaping violence. "I can track," Naya said quietly. "Hunt. Find water. Know which plants heal, which plants kill. Know how to cure meat, preserve food for winter. Know mountain paths, safe trails." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's valuable. We lose hunters every year who don't know the country well enough. You could teach others, lead hunting parties." She turned to Ethan. "And you?" "I can shoot," Ethan said, then felt foolish. Of course he could shoot. Everyone here could probably shoot. "And I can read and write. Keep accounts, I suppose. My father ran a hardware store back in Philadelphia. I know inventory, ordering, basic mathematics." "Can you build? Carpentry work?" "Some. I'm better with tools than I am with a rifle, honestly." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "That's more useful here than you might think. We're always building, always repairing. The canyon's protected, but the weather still beats everything to hell." She gestured toward the window where the timber frame was taking shape. "That barn needs finishing. There's a crew working on it now. Why don't you join them, see if you can make yourself useful? Naya, come with me. I'll introduce you to our hunters, and you can prove what you know." They separated, and Ethan felt a sudden anxiety at being apart from Naya even for a few hours. She must have sensed it because she touched his arm briefly. "I be fine," she said. "You be fine. We meet at sunset." "At sunset," Ethan agreed. The barn crew consisted of 5 men from various backgrounds, 2 former soldiers like himself, a Mexican homesteader who'd fled violence in Sonora, and 2 freed slaves heading west from Texas who'd stopped in redemption and decided to stay. They eyed Ethan warily when he approached, but when he picked up a hammer and started driving nails with competent efficiency, they relaxed. "You know your way around timber," observed one of the former soldiers, a grizzled man named Connor, who'd deserted from the 8th Cavalry 3 years prior. "My father believed in practical education," Ethan said, fitting a crossbeam into place. "Spent every summer as a boy working construction jobs in Philadelphia." "Long way from Philadelphia to here," Connor said. "Long way and more than miles," Ethan agreed. They worked through the morning, the physical labor feeling good after so many days of running and hiding. The barn was ambitious, big enough to shelter 20 horses and store winter hay, and it would take weeks to complete. But there was satisfaction in the work, in creating something instead of destroying it. During a water break, one of the freed slaves, a massive man named Joshua, who spoke with a soft Georgia accent, sat down beside Ethan. "Heard you freed an Apache woman from cavalry custody. That true?" "Yes," Ethan said simply. "Why?" It was the same question Captain Wheeler had asked, and Ethan's answer hadn't changed. "Because it was right." Joshua nodded slowly. "I was property once, owned like a horse or a plow. Man who owned me, he was educated, went to church every Sunday, considered himself civilized, but he bought and sold human beings like livestock." He took a long drink of water. "When I ran, there were good white folks who helped me, hid me in their barns, fed me, pointed me toward the next safe house, even though it could have gotten them killed. You know what they all said when I asked why?" "Because it was right," Ethan said. "Because it was right," Joshua confirmed. Sometimes that's all the reason you need. World tries to convince you otherwise. Tries to make you believe that laws and property and the way things have always been done matters more than what's right.
But it don't. Not really. By midday, they'd made good progress on the barn frame. Ethan was covered in sawdust and sweat. His hands blistered despite the calluses he'd developed, but he felt more useful than he had in months. There was honesty in this work, a clarity of purpose that military service had never provided. He found Naya that evening near the settlement's southern edge, field dressing a small deer she'd brought down. Two of Redemption's regular hunters stood nearby, watching her work with grudging respect. "She's fast," one of them said to Ethan. "Quiet, too. Deer never knew she was there until the arrow hit." "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" the other hunter asked Naya. "Born knowing," Naya said, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she separated hide from muscle. "Apache children learn bow before they learn walk. Could you teach us? The stalking part, I mean. We're decent shots, but we sound like cavalry charges coming through the brush." Naya glanced at Ethan, a question in her eyes. He nodded encouragingly. "If you want," she said to the hunters. "Tomorrow, early, I show you how Apache hunt." The hunters left looking pleased, and Naya finished her work, parceling the meat into portions that would feed a dozen families. "Sarah say we keep haunch for ourselves," she said. "Rest goes to common store." They carried their share back to their small adobe and cooked it simply over the fire, seasoned with sage Naya had gathered. It was the first real meal Ethan had eaten since before the ambush, and it tasted like celebration. "You did well today," he said. "Those hunters respect you." "Respect skill," Naya corrected. "Not me. Not yet. But his start." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "You do well, too. I watch you with barn crew. They treat you like equal, like—" She struggled for the word. "Like I belong?" Ethan suggested. "Yes, belong. Is strange feeling." Ethan understood. For the first time in their lives, they were in a place where their past mattered less than their present contributions, where the uniform Ethan had worn and the bounty on Naya's head were simply facts, not definitions. The next days fell into a rhythm. Ethan worked on the barn and other construction projects around the settlement. Naya taught hunting techniques and led expeditions into the mountains that returned with game and wild plants. In the evenings, they'd share meals and slowly, carefully, began to learn each other beyond the desperate survival that had thrown them together. But peace and redemption was always temporary, always conditional. 3 weeks after their arrival, the warning bell rang. Ethan was on the barn roof when he heard it, 3 sharp clangs that sent ice through his veins. He scrambled down the ladder and ran for their adobe, where Naya was already gathering their few possessions. "What happened?" he demanded. "Riders," Naya said tersely. 6 men. Coming up canyon from south. Sarah say they look like bounty hunters." The settlement was organized chaos, families grabbing children and precious items, weapons being distributed, people heading for the escape tunnels Sarah had mentioned. But a group of men, Connor, Joshua, the hunters who'd been learning from Naya, and several others, were gathering near the canyon entrance instead. "We're not running this time," Connor said when Ethan and Naya joined them. "Running's all we've done for years. Maybe it's time to stand." 6 armed men against what? 15 of us? One of the others said. "Those aren't good odds." "Better than you think," Joshua rumbled. "They expecting scared refugees? They ain't expecting a fight." Sarah appeared, rifle in hand. "This is foolish. We should use the tunnels, disappear into the mountains until they leave. And let them burn everything we've built?" Connor shook his head. "No, I'm done running." "Then you'll die here," Sarah said bluntly. "Maybe, but at least I'll die for something that matters." Ethan looked at Naya. She was checking her bow, her face set with the same expression she'd worn when facing the soldiers who'd captured her. "They come for me," she said quietly. "Bounty hunters always come for me. I won't let redemption burn because I hear." "You don't know they're after you specifically," Ethan argued. "I know," Naya said. "Feel it. Same as desert. Danger has smell." The riders appeared at the canyon mouth 15 minutes later. 6 men, hard-looking and heavily armed, riding in a loose formation that spoke of experience and confidence.
The leader was a tall man with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Real or fake, it was impossible to tell at this distance. Sarah stepped forward to meet them, her rifle held loosely but ready. "This is private land. State your business." The leader dismounted, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "Name's Garrett. I'm a territorial marshal out of Tucson, and I'm tracking fugitives. Got reason to believe you're harboring an Apache woman wanted for murder and a deserter from the 4th Cavalry." "We're harboring lots of people," Sarah said evenly. "That's what redemption is for. But we don't ask questions about pasts here, only care about what folks do in the present." "Noble sentiment," Garrett said, "but it don't change the law. You've got wanted criminals here, and I'm taking them in. Hand them over peaceful, and nobody else gets hurt." "And if we refuse?" Garrett's smile was cold. "Then I deputize every man I brought with me, and we tear this place apart until we find what we're looking for. Your choice." Ethan felt Naya tense beside him. She was calculating, he realized, measuring whether she could take Garrett down before his men could react. It was a suicide mission, and they both knew it. "Wait," Ethan said, stepping forward. "I'm the deserter you're looking for. Private Ethan Carter, 4th Cavalry. Take me and leave everyone else alone." "Ethan, no," Naya started. "It's the right thing," Ethan said quietly, using the words that had defined every choice since the ambush. He looked at Garrett. "There's no bounty on these other people. Just me. So take me and go." Garrett studied him with calculating eyes. "And the Apache woman?" "Gone," Ethan lied. "Headed into Mexico 2 weeks ago. You're wasting your time looking for her here." "That's so." Garrett's gaze swept the assembled settlers and landed on Naya. Even dressed like the others, even with her hair covered, something marked her as different. "That her right there, ain't it? Dark skin, won't meet my eyes. Yeah, that's an Apache woman if I ever seen one." Naya's hand moved toward her knife, but Joshua stepped forward, his massive frame blocking Garrett's view. "That's my wife you're talking about. We come here from Georgia, been married 3 years. You got a problem with that?" Garrett's eyes narrowed. "She don't look like no freed woman to me." "Then you ain't looked at enough freed women," Joshua said calmly. "My mama was half Cherokee. Wife takes after her side of the family." It was a transparent lie. But Joshua delivered it with such conviction that Garrett hesitated. The moment stretched, tension building like a thunderhead about to break. Then one of Garrett's men shifted in his saddle, and Ethan saw what he was reaching for, a wanted poster, folded and tucked into his saddlebag. If they pulled that out and compared the drawing to Naya's face, the lie would collapse. "We're wasting time," Ethan said loudly. "You want a deserter? I already said I'll come. The bounty's $40, isn't it? That's more than you'll get for chasing ghosts." "Deserter's $40 dead or alive," Garrett agreed. "Apache woman's 50, plus whatever else we can sell her for across the border." The casual cruelty of it hung in the air. Sarah's rifle came up slightly, and Ethan saw Connor's hand drift toward his revolver. This was going to turn into a bloodbath unless someone defused it. "There is no Apache woman here," Sarah said, her voice hard as stone. "Just settlers trying to survive. You want the deserter? Fine, take him and go. But you start making accusations about my people based on skin color alone, and we're going to have a problem." Garrett's men were spreading out now, hands on weapons, clearly preparing for violence. 6 against 15 looked like poor odds for the bounty hunters. But they were professionals, and the settlers were mostly farmers and refugees. Blood would flow on both sides, and Ethan couldn't let that happen. "I'll go with you," he said again. "Right now. No fight, no trouble. Just let me say goodbye." Garrett considered this. "You try anything, and we start shooting. Understood?" "Understood," Ethan said. He walked back to where Naya stood, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Don't do this," she said in Apache, words he'd learned over the past weeks. "Don't leave me." "I have to," Ethan replied in the same language, his pronunciation rough but comprehensible. "If they find you, they'll do worse than kill you. You know that." "Then we fight. Die together." "No." Ethan took her hands, not caring who saw, not caring what it revealed. "You survive. That's all that matters. You survive and you live free. And maybe someday this war ends, and we can..." "Can what?" Naya's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Build house? Raise children? Pretend world forgive us? Maybe, Ethan said. Or maybe just survive is enough. Maybe that's all we get. But I need you to have that chance. Time's up, Garrett called. Let's go, deserter. Ethan released Naya's hands and walked toward the bounty hunters. Connor stepped forward, his face grim. You don't have to do this, son. We can fight. And half of you will die, Ethan said. That's not a price I'm willing to pay. He mounted one of the spare horses Garrett's men provided, and they bound his hands in front of him. As they prepared to leave, Garrett gave the settlement one final look. You're all living on borrowed time here, he said. Territory's getting civilized, and places like this won't be tolerated much longer. Next marshal that comes through might not be as reasonable as me. Your version of reasonable involves kidnapping and slavery, Sarah said coldly. I'd hate to see what unreasonable looks like. Garrett laughed, an ugly sound. You'll find out soon enough. They rode out of Redemption, and Ethan twisted in his saddle for one last look at the settlement. Naya stood at the front of the crowd, her hand raised in farewell or blessing or simply goodbye. He tried to memorize her face, knowing he might never see her again. The journey to Fort Bowie took 4 days. Garrett's men treated Ethan like cargo, barely speaking to him except to give orders. They camped rough each night, and Ethan was kept tied to a tree while they slept, unable to escape even if he'd been foolish enough to try. On the second night, one of Garrett's men, a nervous fellow named Pike, brought Ethan water and lingered afterward. You really desert for an Apache woman? Pike asked. I made a choice, Ethan said carefully, about who I wanted to be versus who the army told me I had to be. That woman back at Redemption, the one the big freedman claimed was his wife. That was her, wasn't it? The Apache you're protecting. Ethan said nothing. Garrett knows, Pike continued. He's not stupid, but he also knows if we'd tried to take her, we'd all be dead now, so he settled for you. The man paused. For what it's worth, I think you did something brave back there. Stupid, but brave. Sometimes they're the same thing, Ethan said. They reached Fort Bowie on the afternoon of the 4th day. The fort looked exactly as Ethan remembered it, dusty, hot, and full of soldiers who saw the world in clear divisions of us and them, civilized and savage, right and wrong. Garrett delivered him to the guardhouse and collected his $40 bounty. As he was leaving, he paused at the cell door. That Apache woman, Garrett said quietly. She'll be dead within 6 months. They always are. The desert gets them, or the soldiers do, or bounty hunters like me. You sacrificed yourself for nothing. If she gets 6 more months of freedom because of what I did, Ethan said, then it was worth everything. Garrett shook his head and walked away. Ethan was alone in the cell, staring at walls he'd last seen as a loyal soldier, waiting for a court-martial that would almost certainly end with a rope. But 3 hours later, something unexpected happened. Frank Dalton appeared outside his cell, looking grim. They're not going to court-martial you, the former marshal said without preamble. Why not? Because the army doesn't want the publicity. A soldier who freed an Apache woman out of conscience. That story gets out. It might make people start questioning this whole frontier war. Better to handle it quietly. Dalton's expression darkened. They're going to execute you tomorrow at dawn. No trial, no testimony, just a firing squad and a quiet burial. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. That's murder. It's expedience, and out here they're usually the same thing. Dalton pulled a key from his pocket.
But I didn't ride 4 days just to watch you die. What are you doing? Same thing I did at Fort Apache. Giving you a choice. The key turned in the lock and the cell door swung open. There's a horse waiting at the east wall. Supplies for a week. You ride hard and you can make it back to Redemption before they even know you're gone. Why do you keep helping me? Ethan asked. Because I've been watching this frontier tear itself apart for 20 years, and I'm tired of seeing the good people destroyed while the monsters thrive. Dalton's voice was rough with emotion. You chose mercy over orders. That makes you rare as diamonds out here, son. And I'll be damned if I let them kill you for it. If I run, you'll be implicated. I'm already implicated in more than you know. One more mark on my soul won't make much difference. Dalton gestured toward the open cell. Now go, before I change my mind. Ethan hesitated only a moment, then clasped Dalton's hand. Thank you for everything. Don't thank me. Just live. Live well enough for both of us. Ethan slipped out of the cell and through the darkening fort,
moving like Naya had taught him, quiet, careful, invisible. He found the horse exactly where Dalton had promised, saddled and ready, and swung up onto its back. As he rode toward the eastern wall, a shout went up behind him. Someone had discovered his escape. Rifles cracked, and bullets whined past his head. But the horse was fast, and the darkness was deep, and within minutes the fort was disappearing behind him. He rode northwest through the night, pushing the horse as hard as he dared, heading back toward the box canyon and the settlement and the woman who taught him that choosing right over easy was the only choice worth making. Behind him, the frontier war continued its brutal course. But ahead, somewhere in the darkness, was a different kind of future. One built on shared survival and slowly dissolving certainties, on the radical notion that people were people, regardless of which side of a war they'd been born on. Ethan urged the horse faster, racing toward redemption, and whatever came next, knowing that he'd burned every bridge behind him, and that there was no going back to the life he'd once known. But for the first time since the ambush, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward someone, and that made all the difference in the world. The horse collapsed 3 miles from redemption, foam on its muzzle and sides heaving like a bellows. Ethan had pushed it too hard through the night, desperate to reach the canyon before the army sent pursuit. He stripped off the saddle and bridle, giving the animal a chance to recover or die on its own terms, then ran the final distance on foot. Dawn was breaking over the rim when he stumbled into the canyon entrance. The guard on duty, a former prospector named Webb, raised his rifle, then lowered it in shock. "Carter? We thought they'd have you in front of a firing squad by now." "They tried," Ethan gasped, his lungs burning. "Where's Naya?" "Hunting party, up in the high country. Left yesterday at first light." Webb studied Ethan with worried eyes. "You being here, that's going to bring trouble down on us, isn't it?" "Yes," Ethan said honestly. "Probably within a day, maybe 2. I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go." Webb was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "Hell, we're all living on borrowed time anyway. Come on, let's get you to Sarah before you collapse." Sarah Ming was at the common house organizing breakfast distribution when Ethan stumbled through the door. Her expression cycled through surprise, resignation, and something that might have been grudging respect. "You escaped," she said. It wasn't a question. "A friend helped me. The same one who helped me escape Fort Apache." Ethan swayed on his feet, exhaustion catching up with him now that he'd stopped moving. "I know what this means. I know what's coming. But I had to—" "Sit down before you fall down," Sarah interrupted, guiding him to a bench. She brought him water and bread, watching him eat with the same calculating expression she wore when inventorying supplies. "The hunting party is due back this afternoon. Until then, you rest. After that, we decide what to do." "There's only one thing to do," Ethan said. "I leave. Draw the army away from here before they connect me to redemption." "And go where? You're a wanted man from here to California. Every fort, every settlement, every bounty hunter in the territory will be looking for you." Sarah sat down across from him. "Running alone, you'll last maybe a week. Better a week than bringing destruction here." "Noble," Sarah said dryly. "Also stupid. You think Naya's going to let you run off to die alone after she spent the last 4 days hunting enough meat to feed this settlement through winter? That woman works like she's trying to earn the right to exist. Like if she provides enough value, maybe people will forget she's supposed to be the enemy." The words hit Ethan hard because they were true. He'd seen it in the way Naya pushed herself on every hunt and how she shared every piece of knowledge she had about surviving in this country, in the way she'd started teaching Apache to some of the children so they could learn multiple languages. She was trying to prove her humanity to people who'd been taught she didn't have any. "I don't want her to have to choose between me and safety," Ethan said quietly. "Then you don't understand her at all," Sarah replied. "She already made that choice in the desert when she saved a dying soldier who wore the same uniform as the men who killed her family. Everything since then has just been her living with the consequences." The hunting party returned late that afternoon with 2 deer and an elk, enough meat to last weeks. Naya was near the back of the group, her bow across her shoulders, talking with one of the other hunters about track patterns in the high meadows. She looked strong and capable and more at peace than Ethan had ever seen her. Then she saw him. She dropped the rope she was carrying and ran, closing the distance between them in seconds. Her hands gripped his arms hard enough to bruise, her eyes searching his face for injuries or deception. "They said you gone," she said, her English rapid and urgent. "Said bounty hunter take you to fort, said you die." "I escaped. A friend helped me, same as before." Ethan covered her hands with his own.
"I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come back. I'm going to bring the army down on this place." "Good," Naya said fiercely. "Let them come. We fight together this time. No more you sacrifice alone." "Naya, you don't understand. They'll bring dozens of soldiers, maybe more. Redemption can't stand against that." "Then we leave Redemption. Go deeper into mountains. Find new place." Her grip tightened. "But we go together. No more apart. No more you decide what best for me." Connor approached, his weathered face serious. "She's right, you know. If the army's coming, we need to prepare or evacuate. Standing around arguing about nobility isn't going to save anyone." By evening, the entire settlement had gathered in the common house to debate their options. Some wanted to use the escape tunnels and scatter into the mountains. Others wanted to stay and fight. A few suggested turning Ethan over to the army in hopes of avoiding retaliation. "That won't work," Frank Dalton said. He'd arrived an hour earlier, his horse lathered and exhausted, bearing news that made everyone's blood run cold. "I came to warn you. The Army's not just sending a patrol. They're sending a full company, 80 men under Captain Wheeler. They're calling it a punitive expedition against hostile sympathizers." The room erupted in angry voices. Sarah had to fire her rifle into the ceiling to restore order. 80 soldiers against what, maybe 30 of us who can fight? Someone shouted. "That's suicide." "It's worse than suicide," Dalton said grimly. "Wheeler's got authorization to use extreme measures. They're not planning to arrest anyone. They're planning to make an example." The implications settled over the room like a shroud. This wasn't about capturing a deserter anymore. This was about sending a message to anyone who might show mercy to the enemy, anyone who might question the righteousness of the frontier war. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. 2 days? Maybe 3? They're moving slower than a single patrol would, bringing supply wagons and field artillery. "Artillery," Connor said softly. "They really do mean to wipe us out." Ethan stood, and the room fell silent. "This is my fault. I'll ride out to meet them, surrender myself." "Maybe if they have me, they'll leave Redemption alone." "You know they won't," Dalton said. "Wheeler's orders came from Territorial Command. This is about more than one deserter now. This is about crushing any settlement that harbors fugitives, any place that offers refuge to people the territory has deemed undesirable." "Then we evacuate," Sarah said firmly. "Pack what we can carry, use the tunnels, scatter into the high country. We've planned for this." "And abandon everything we've built?" Joshua's deep voice carried across the room. "This is the first place I've lived as a free man where nobody cared about the color of my skin. I'm not running again." "Better to run and live than stay and die," Sarah countered. "Is it?" Joshua stood, his massive frame commanding attention. "I spent 30 years as property, ran north, found freedom, then had to keep running because freedom meant different things in different places. I'm tired of running. Maybe it's time to stand." "Stand and die," Sarah said. "Is that really better?" "Maybe," Joshua said quietly. "Maybe dying for something you believe in is better than living as a fugitive forever." The debate raged for hours. Ethan sat beside Naya, listening to people argue about courage and survival, duty and pragmatism, life and death. These were people who'd already lost everything once. Some of them couldn't bear to lose it again. Others couldn't bear to keep running. Finally, Connor stood. "I say we vote. Those who want to evacuate, use the tunnels, scatter. That's one option. Those who want to stay and fight, knowing we'll probably die, that's the other. But everyone decides for themselves, no judgment either way." The vote split almost evenly. 15 people chose to evacuate. 14 chose to stay and fight. The settlement was fracturing along the fault line of how much more loss each person could endure. Sarah looked around the room, her face heavy with sorrow. "Then we split. Those who want to leave, you've got 24 hours to pack and prepare. Those staying, we need to fortify positions, inventory weapons, and prepare for a siege we probably can't win." She paused. "And may whatever forces govern this brutal world have mercy on us all." The next day was chaos. Families packed wagons with everything they could carry.
Children cried, not understanding why they were leaving the only home some of them had ever known. The hunters went out one last time to bring in meat for both groups. Those leaving would need food for the journey, and those staying would need supplies for a siege. Ethan worked alongside Connor and Joshua to fortify the canyon entrance, piling rocks and timber to create defensive positions. It was futile, really. Artillery would reduce their barriers to splinters, but doing something felt better than waiting helplessly. Naya found him near sunset, sitting on a half-built barricade, staring at the work that would probably prove useless. "You should go with the others," Ethan said without looking at her. "Get into the mountains, disappear. You're good at that." "And you stay here to die?" Naya sat beside him, her shoulder touching his. "That not how this work?" "How what works?" "Us." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "In desert, you save me. I save you. We save each other. That not change because army come." "Naya, there's 80 soldiers coming with artillery. This isn't the desert where we can hide in canyons and slip away. This is a battle we can't win." "Maybe," she agreed, "but maybe we don't need win. Maybe we just need show them that some things worth dying for." Ethan looked at her finally, this woman who'd taught him that the line between enemy and friend was thinner than army propaganda suggested, who'd shown him that humanity existed on both sides of every war. Her face was set with the same determination she'd worn when facing the bounty hunters, when running from soldiers, when choosing to save a dying cavalryman despite every reason to let him perish. "I love you," he said. The words surprised him, but once spoken, he knew they were true. Not the desperate attachment of shared survival, but something deeper that had grown in the quiet moments between danger, in the language lessons, and shared meals, and slow building of trust. Naya's eyes widened slightly. She was quiet for a long moment. "Love," she repeated, testing the word. "Is big word. Heavy word." "Yes," Ethan said. "It is. In my language, we say, shiu hujo, mean walk in beauty with me, mean more than just feeling, mean choosing to walk same path even when path is hard." She squeezed his hand. "Shiu hojo, Ethan Carter. I walk in beauty with you, even to death." They sat together as darkness fell, and the stars emerged in their thousands, holding hands on a barricade that wouldn't save them, preparing for a battle that would probably kill them, and finding peace in the certainty that they'd made the right choices, even if those choices led to terrible ends. The evacuees left before dawn, slipping through the northern tunnels in small groups to avoid detection. Sarah Ming led them, and before she left, she found Ethan and Naya one last time. "I think you're both fools," she said bluntly, "but I understand why you're staying. Sometimes the only freedom left is choosing how you die." She handed Naya a small leather pouch. "Medicine herbs. For pain, when it comes. Use them wisely." "Thank you," Naya said, "for everything. For letting us be human here." Sarah's eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "You were always human. The world just needed reminding." She looked at Ethan. "Take care of her." "We'll take care of each other," Ethan replied. The evacuees disappeared into the darkness, and Redemption became a settlement of 14 souls preparing to face 80 soldiers. They spent the day checking weapons, rationing ammunition, saying things to each other that people say when they know death is coming. The army arrived on the third day, exactly as Dalton had predicted. They came at dawn with drums and bugles, a show of force designed to terrify. 80 soldiers in formation, supply wagons, and 2 small field cannons that could reduce the settlement to rubble. Captain Wheeler rode at the head of the column, his hawk face impassive. He surveyed the canyon entrance and the hastily built defenses with something like contempt. "Civilians of the illegal settlement known as Redemption," Wheeler's voice carried across the distance. "You are harboring fugitives from military justice and providing material support to hostile forces. By order of territorial command, you will surrender all weapons and submit to arrest or face immediate military action." Connor stepped forward, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. "This is private land. You've got no authority here." "I have all the authority I need," Wheeler said coldly. "This territory is under military governance. Every settlement, every acre, every person falls under Army jurisdiction during time of war." "We're not at war with you," Connor said. "We're just people trying to live in peace. You're sheltering enemies of the United States. That makes you combatants." Wheeler's gaze swept the defenses and found Ethan standing beside Naya. "Private Carter, step forward and surrender yourself." Ethan stood his ground. "I'm not your private anymore. I don't recognize your authority or your war." "Then you'll die with these traitors," Wheeler said. He turned to his artillery officer. "Range? 300 yards, sir, well within effective distance. Load canister shot. On my command, you will reduce the defensive positions and any structures behind them to rubble." The artillery crews moved with practiced efficiency, loading the cannons with canister rounds that would spray hundreds of metal balls like giant shotguns. At this range, against wooden barricades and adobe buildings, the effect would be devastating. "Last chance," Wheeler called. "Surrender or die." The defenders looked at each other. No one moved. No one lowered their weapons. They'd all made their choice. "Fire," Wheeler commanded. The cannons roared. Canister shot screamed through the air and tore into the barricades, splintering wood and shattering stone. Ethan threw himself flat, pulling Naya down with him as metal balls whined overhead. The sound was like the end of the world. When the smoke cleared, 2 of their defenders were dead, and the barricades were torn to pieces. The soldiers were advancing now, rifles ready, moving with the confidence of men who knew they'd already won. "Fall back," Connor shouted. "To the buildings." They retreated in chaos, firing as they went, trying to slow the advance. Ethan shot a soldier who got too close, then another, the rifle kicks jarring his shoulder but his hands steady. Naya moved beside him with her bow, each arrow finding a target, each shot precise and deadly. They made it to the common house and barricaded themselves inside with the remaining defenders. 10 of them left now, against 70-plus soldiers who were surrounding the building. "It's over," someone said. "We're trapped." "Not over yet," Joshua said grimly. He was bleeding from a wound in his side but still standing. "They want this building. They'll pay for every foot." The soldiers didn't assault immediately. Wheeler was too smart for that. Instead, they set up positions and began methodical fire, breaking windows and splintering walls, making the interior increasingly untenable. "They're going to burn us out," Connor said, coughing on gun smoke. "That's what I'd do. Why lose men in an assault when you can just set fire to the building?" As if in confirmation, a burning torch arced through a broken window and landed on the wooden floor. Then another. The building was dry as kindling from months of desert heat. "Tunnel," Naya said urgently. "Common house has tunnel too. Sarah, show me. For emergencies." "Where?" Connor demanded. Naya led them to a corner where supply barrels were stacked. Behind them was a trapdoor Ethan had never noticed, leading down into darkness. One by one, the survivors dropped through, leaving the burning building behind. The tunnel was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for Joshua's shoulders. They crawled for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 15 minutes, following the passage as it sloped downward and curved north. Behind them, they could hear muffled gunfire and shouting as the soldiers realized their quarry had escaped. They emerged in a small cave half a mile from the settlement, hidden behind a screen of juniper and rock. From there, they could see smoke rising from Redemption as the soldiers systematically burned everything that remained. "Everything we built," Connor said softly. "Gone." "We're alive," Joshua countered. "That's more than we had any right to expect." The survivors split into smaller groups. Connor and 3 others would head west toward California. Joshua and 2 companions planned to go south into Mexico. That left Ethan and Naya and 2 other defenders, a Mexican farmer named Carlos and a young woman named Ruth, who'd fled an abusive husband in Kansas. "We go north," Naya said firmly, "into high mountains. Army don't follow there, too cold, too hard. Apache country." "Your people," Ethan said. "The ones you were traveling to when you found me. Are they still there?" "If they live, yes. Hidden Valley, 3 days north. Old place, sacred place. Army never find." Carlos looked uncertain. "They'll accept white people? Mexicans?" "They accept anyone who hate Army," Naya said with grim humor. "That include all of us now." They traveled by night, moving through country that grew progressively more rugged and beautiful. The desert gave way to pine forests and mountain meadows. The air turned cooler, scented with sap and clean stone. They saw no sign of pursuit but remained cautious, never making fires, sleeping in shifts. On the 3rd night, Naya led them up a narrow canyon that seemed to end in a sheer cliff face. But there was a passage, hidden unless you knew exactly where to look, that wound through the rock and emerged into a small valley. Apache dwellings dotted the valley floor, wickiups made of branches and hide, nearly invisible against the landscape. People emerged as they approached, weapons ready, wary. Naya called out in Apache, identifying herself. An older woman stepped forward, her face lined with age and hardship, but her eyes sharp as obsidian. She studied Naya for a long moment, then spoke rapidly in their shared language. Naya responded, gesturing to Ethan and the others. The conversation went on for several minutes, with other Apache gathering to listen. Finally, the older woman nodded and addressed Ethan directly in heavily accented English. Naya say you save her life. Choose her over your people. This true?
Yes, Ethan said simply. Why? It was a question he'd been asked many times now, and his answer had evolved from simple righteousness to something more complex and true. Because she showed me that the people I was taught to hate were just people. Because choosing her meant choosing the kind of man I wanted to be instead of the kind of soldier the army wanted to make me. The older woman translated this for the others, and Ethan saw expressions shift from suspicion to something that might have been understanding. They'd all made similar choices, he realized, all chosen survival and humanity over the rigid categories the war demanded. You stay, the older woman said finally. But you work. Everyone work. No free living. I wouldn't expect it any other way, Ethan said. The Apache allowed them to build a shelter on the edge of the valley, where the trees met the meadow. It was small, just enough space for sleeping and a fire, but it was theirs. Carlos and Ruth built nearby, and slowly a small community began to form. Apache who'd lost their families, white deserters and Mexican refugees, all finding common ground in their rejection of the war that had tried to define them. The seasons turned. Summer faded into autumn and autumn into winter. Snow came to the high valley, transforming it into a place of stark beauty. Ethan learned more Apache, improving his vocabulary beyond basic survival words. Naya taught him how to hunt in the mountains, how to move through deep snow, how to read weather in the clouds. In return, he taught her to read English, using a battered Bible that Ruth had carried from Kansas. They would sit by their fire in the evenings, Naya slowly sounding out words while Ethan corrected her pronunciation gently. Why this word rough, but that word cough sound different? Naya demanded one night, frustrated. English make no sense. I know, Ethan laughed. I'm sorry my language is ridiculous. Not your language, Naya corrected. Our language now. I learn English. You learn Apache. We meet in middle. Spring brought news from the outside world. Travelers passing through reported that the territory was finally pushing for statehood, that the Indian wars were winding down as tribes were forced onto reservations, that the frontier was being civilized whether its inhabitants wanted it or not. But in their hidden valley, those changes felt distant and abstract. They had their own concerns, planting crops in the small fields the Apache had carved from the forest, hunting enough game to supplement their supplies, maintaining the careful balance of a community where former enemies had become neighbors. One evening in late spring, Ethan and Naya climbed to a ridge overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Below, smoke rose from cooking fires, and they could hear children laughing as they played some game that mixed Apache and English rules. You think about Philadelphia? Naya asked. Your mother, your old life? Sometimes, Ethan admitted. I wonder if she knows I'm alive, if she thinks about me. You could write letter, send with traders. And say what? That I'm living with Apache in the mountains? That I chose this over everything she wanted for me? Ethan shook his head. She wouldn't understand. Maybe she would, Naya said. Maybe people more ready to understand than we think. We just have to give them chance. Ethan looked at her, this woman who'd traveled from enemy to savior, to partner, to something deeper than he had words to describe. She'd taught him a language he'd never expected to learn and shown him a version of himself he'd never known existed. I want to marry you, he said. The words came out abruptly, without planning, but they felt right. Naya turned to him, surprise clear on her face. Marry. Like white people marry? Like any people marry. Whatever ceremony matters to you, whatever words make it real. I just want... He struggled to articulate the feeling. I want everyone to know that we chose this,
that we're not just surviving together by accident, we're building something intentional. Naya was quiet, looking out over the valley. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. In Apache way, marriage is simple. Man and woman decide to be together, build home together. Family recognize this. Celebrate. That all. Then let's do that, Ethan said. Apache way, your way. And white way too, Naya said. Ruth say words from Bible. Make it real for your people too, even if they not here to see. They married a week later in a ceremony that blended traditions and languages, sacred and practical. The older Apache woman spoke blessings in her language. Ruth read from the Bible in English. They exchanged promises in both tongues, speaking words of commitment that transcended the cultural boundaries that had tried to keep them apart. That night, in their small shelter, they lay together and talked about the future, about the possibility of children who would grow up speaking two languages, who would never have to choose between two worlds because they'd belong to both, about the slow work of building a life in the margins, in the spaces the war hadn't quite reached. You think this last? Naya asked. Peace here in Valley? I don't know, Ethan said honestly. The territory is changing. Eventually someone will find us. Someone will decide this valley needs to be claimed or settled or civilized. Then we move again, find new place. Or we stay and fight. Naya turned to face him in the darkness. You want fight? No, Ethan said. I'm tired of fighting, but I'm also tired of running. Maybe there comes a time when you have to stand for something, even if standing means losing. Like redemption, Naya said quietly. Like redemption, Ethan agreed. Those people chose to stay because they were tired of being pushed around, tired of living like fugitives. They lost, but they lost on their own terms. And that enough? Ethan thought about Connor and Joshua, about the defenders who'd fought knowing they'd probably die, about the choice between endless flight and a stand that might be futile but was at least intentional. Sometimes, he said, choosing how you face the world is the only freedom you have. Redemption stood for something, even in defeat. This valley stands for something too. And if the time comes when we have to defend it, I think we should. Not because we'll win, but because some things are worth defending. Naya rested her head against his chest, and he could feel her breathing, steady and strong. Shiu-hu-shum, she whispered. Walk in beauty with me, even when path is hard. Even when the path is hard, Ethan promised. They fell asleep like that, two people from opposite sides of a brutal war, finding peace in a hidden valley while the world outside continued its violent transformation. Morning would bring the usual work, hunting, planting, maintaining their fragile community. But for now, they had this moment of certainty, this small victory of choosing each other over everything the war had tried to make them. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The valley slept peacefully, protected by mountains and distance and the hope that some places might escape the frontier's violence. It was a fragile hope, conditional and temporary, but it was hope nonetheless. And in a world defined by blood and conquest, by rigid categories and brutal enforcement, hope was its own kind of revolution. The choice to love across enemy lines, to build instead of destroy, to see humanity in those the world deemed subhuman, these were acts of defiance more powerful than any rifle, more enduring than any fortress. Ethan and Naya had both lost everything to reach this valley: family, homeland, the certainties that had once structured their lives. But in losing everything, they'd found something neither had expected: the freedom to define themselves outside the boxes the war demanded, the possibility of a future built on shared humanity instead of enforced division. The frontier war would continue its brutal course. Soldiers would fight and die. Apache would be driven onto reservations. The territory would be carved into states and counties and claims. But in the hidden spaces, in the margins and the mountains, people like Ethan and Naya would continue to exist. Proof that another way was possible, that the line between enemy and friend was a choice rather than a fate. And someday, perhaps, the world would catch up to what they already knew: that survival on any frontier, whether geographic or moral, required not conquest but courage, not the courage to kill, but the courage to choose mercy over orders, humanity over hatred, and love over the comfortable certainties of war. In the hidden valley beneath the endless western sky, two former enemies built a life together. It was small and precarious and would likely not survive the coming changes, But it was theirs, chosen and intentional, and that made it worth every sacrifice they'd endured to reach it. The desert had taught them survival. The war had taught them loss. But together, in this valley where languages mixed and old boundaries dissolved, they were learning something more important than either. They were learning that the most radical act in a world built on division was simply to choose each other, day after day, and call that choice by its proper name: love, partnership, home. And beneath the stars and the silence, in a shelter built by their own hands, they held each other and slept the sleep of people who'd finally stopped running, who'd found something worth standing for, who'd discovered that the greatest freedom was not escape, but the choice to build something beautiful in the ruins of what the war had tried to destroy.